In June 1973, a young couple from Edmonton, Canada, 27-year-old Ron Yakimchuk and his 23-year-old wife Terry Pettit, set off on a cross-country road trip with high hopes for the future. They packed their belongings into a battered 1959 Volkswagen Beetle, so dilapidated it had mismatched red and green body panels, and strapped their mattress to the roof of the vehicle. Ron and Terry planned to attend a friend's wedding in Montreal scheduled for June 16th. After this, they planned on continuing east to Canada's maritime provinces, where Ron had a lead on a teaching job, and Terry, a journalist, hoped to find work at a newspaper. It was essentially a delayed honeymoon road adventure, as the free-spirited couple looked forward to starting a new life out east. Friends gathered to see them off from Edmonton on a cloudy Sunday morning, snapping a photo of the pair in their overloaded Beetle as they drove away. No one imagined it would be the last time they'd ever be seen. Both Ron and Terry were well known among their peers. Terry was a reporter at the Edmonton Journal, and Ron had been the editor of The Poundmaker, a student newspaper at the University of Alberta. They had met during their university days and shared a love of adventure and journalism. The couple had postponed their departure several times, but by early June they finally hit the road, excited and full of optimism. Friends later recalled how eager the two were for a change of scenery after years in Edmonton's media scene. Ron and Terry's journey initially seemed to go as planned. They made a brief detour to visit friends near Brandon, Manitoba, a stop along their eastward route. By June 12, 1973, the couple had reached Dryden, a town in northwestern Ontario. From Dryden, they mailed a postcard back to a friend in Edmonton. According to some sources, Terry had bet a friend that the rickety Volkswagen would survive the cross-Canada trek, while her friend said they'd never make it to Ontario. That Dryden postcard would become the last known contact from the couple. After Dryden, the trail grew cold. Ron and Terry never showed up at the Montreal area wedding they were expected to attend on June 16th. Concern began to spread among their friends and family immediately. However, when the couple failed to reach their destination in the Maritimes in due course, this concern became fear and then outright panic. In the days and weeks following, loved ones grew increasingly alarmed. The couple, who were known to be responsible and considerate, had effectively fallen off the face of the earth during what should have been a routine drive across Ontario. Early on, police were slow to act, reasoning that a pair of young adults on a road trip could be anywhere and might simply have decided to take a detour or delay. By the time an investigation belatedly kicked off, any clues along their route had long since evaporated. From the beginning, the evidence suggested that Ron and Terry didn't disappear by choice, though it appears some investigators figured they had just started a new life. Soon, however, investigators found that their bank accounts were never touched after June 1973. The cash they had in the accounts for the purposes of the trip remained unspent. These signs indicated the couple hadn't started a new life in secret. All their financial activity simply stopped. Over the decades, various theories have emerged to explain how an entire couple and their car could simply vanish. The most straightforward theory is that Ron and Terry suffered a crash in a remote area of northern Ontario. The Trans-Canada Highway in 1973 included long stretches of isolated, hilly roads around Lake Superior, with steep embankments and countless lakes and dense bush along the way. It's possible the overloaded Beetle swerved off the road, perhaps to avoid an animal or due to driver fatigue at night, and plunged into a thick forest or deep lake, hidden from view. If the vehicle plunged into a body of water along a desolate portion of the Trans-Canada Highway, there would be virtually no chance they would ever be recovered. Another possibility is that the couple fell victim to foul play during their journey. The couple may have picked up a hitchhiker or stopped to help someone, only to be met with violence. If they were attacked by a criminal, the perpetrator could have disposed of their bodies and hidden or destroyed the car, which might explain why it never turned up. This theory, while plausible, has no hard evidence behind it, as no known suspects or crime scenes have ever been linked to their disappearance. Further, given that we have photographic evidence of how packed their vehicle was, I'm not convinced they could have picked up a hitchhiker even if they wanted to. The picture we have is from Edmonton, but this was all the stuff they'd packed up to move to eastern Canada, so I can't imagine they had any more room in the Beetle at that point. Another theory involves a detour they may have taken. Given the challenging driving on the northern Trans-Canada route, Ron and Terry may have decided to take an alternate path. There was speculation that they detoured south across the U.S. border to find an easier road east. There are no records confirming the two crossed the border, and it's unknown if police ever found evidence of them in the States. This idea essentially overlaps with both the accident and foul play theories, merely shifting the location. Again, without any confirmed sightings or documentation from U.S. authorities, the cross-border detour remains an unverified guess. Personally, I think the idea that their vehicle went off the Trans-Canada Highway into a body of water is the most likely. If they were driving at night and the driver dozed off, they could have easily driven off the road and into a lake or deep river, never to be seen again. Another major problem with this case, and why it will likely never be solved, is that there's multiple possible routes between Dryden and Montreal. The shortest of these routes, along the Trans-Canada Highway, is approximately 1,200 miles, and most of this stretch is virtually uninhabited. In late August 2011, the quiet community of Chilliwack, British Columbia was shaken by a grim discovery. Corey Sherby, a 38-year-old logger, was found dead in his own living room by his mother after a weekend where he didn't contact any of his friends or family. He was discovered kneeling in front of his couch, head face down into the cushions, with a dark pool of blood dried on the floor. And look, I'm just going to state my bias right out of the gate here. This was a Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigation, and the RCMP seems to botch every other investigation they handle. On Monday, August 22, 2011, Gladys Sherby used her spare key to enter Corey's home after he hadn't answered calls for days. She walked into a scene no parent should ever face. Corey was on his knees with his upper body draped over the couch, unresponsive and cold. Startled and in panic, Gladys screamed and pulled her son onto the floor, noticing his face was ghostly white, and that part of his scalp and ears appeared to be missing or damaged. The RCMP arrived and examined the scene. According to one of the first responders, there were no obvious signs of trauma, no indications of a struggle, and no forced entry into the house. Further, the autopsy confirmed the existence of lethal levels of coke and alcohol in his system. With that finding, the RCMP concluded that Corey's death was accidental and quickly closed the case without treating the home as a crime scene. Ed and Gladys, however, immediately felt that this conclusion was wrong. They knew their son to be health conscious and insisted that he didn't struggle with substances. To them, the idea that Corey had suddenly binged on a lethal combination of coke and alcohol was inexplicable. Moreover, the bizarre condition in which the body was found did not sit right with the family, or even some experts they consulted. Corey's body position, kneeling and slumped forward, didn't look like a natural resting position for someone who simply overdosed and passed away. The Sherbys began to suspect that something awful had happened to Corey that weekend, something that was being overlooked. One eerie clue was a cardboard box found in Corey's front hall closet, scrawled with the unsettling message, "Better be a funeral," in black marker. This cryptic phrase, discovered as the family was cleaning out the house, sent chills down their spines. It felt like a warning or threat left behind by whoever might have been involved in Corey's death. and it wasn't the only strange detail. As the family carefully went through the house, they noticed bloody footprints on the stairs and what looked like blood smeared on a door frame and splattered in various spots. These red stains hadn't been documented or explained by the police. Notably, as they were cleaning up the house, they also found a piece of his scalp on the floor, which they considered inconsistent with the official narrative. Ed also recalled that Corey's wallet, recovered at the scene, had a bloody fingerprint on it, and that approximately $140 in cash was missing from it. To the family, these details were alarming signs that pointed to a struggle or foul play. They couldn't shake the image of a violent encounter taking place in Corey's home. Another puzzling element was a person who might have been one of the last to see Corey alive. On the Friday before his body was found, August 19, 2011, Ed Sherby had dropped by Corey's house around 9 p.m. to deliver some delicious hamburgers for the weekend. To his surprise, he saw an unknown woman in the house with his son. This woman, wearing a leather jacket and slippers, was not Corey's girlfriend, and Ed had never seen her before. Ed later recounted that he even remarked, half-jokingly, that he didn't know Corey had company, after which Corey walked him out of the house. That mysterious woman has never been identified, and police did not pursue finding out who she was at the time. Within days of Corey's death, yet another disturbing event deepened the family's suspicions. One early morning, a high school friend of Corey's named Tammy Borden showed up at Ed and Gladys's door, banging frantically and waking them up. Tammy was visibly upset, and in a trembling confession, claimed she knew Corey had been ended over money and illicit substances. She said there were a number of people involved, but ominously refused to name anyone, saying she feared for her own life. Before the Sherbys could learn more, Tammy fled. Tragically, only a few months later, in February 2012, Tammy Borden herself died under mysterious circumstances. Her sudden death, coming so soon after her cryptic warning, struck the Sherby family as too coincidental to ignore. It was as if anyone who knew something about Corey's case was being silenced by design. All of these odd clues and events convinced Ed and Gladys that the police's overdose theory didn't account for the full picture. In their eyes, the evidence hinted at a staged scene or a cover-up, and they were determined to push for a deeper investigation. On July 30th, 2012, about a year after Corey's death, Corey's uncle, Marty Jordan, wrote a detailed 5-page letter to the RCMP on behalf of the family. In this letter, Jordan formally complained about the quality of the investigation and urged the police to reopen the case. He listed the family's many concerns and the unanswered questions. The RCMP treated Marty Jordan's letter as a formal public complaint and conducted an internal review of the case. In June 2013, nearly 11 months after the complaint, the family received an 8-page response from the chief superintendent of the RCMP. This RCMP review essentially defended the initial investigation, concluding that the officers had done a thorough job. The response tried to explain away several of the suspicious details that the Sherbys had flagged. According to the response letter, the large pool of blood under Corey's body was not actually unusual. Rather, it was comprised of various bodily fluids that one would expect from a body that had been decomposing over a hot summer weekend. In other words, what the family interpreted as signs of violence might have simply been the unfortunate byproduct of a delayed discovery. The bloody footprints and smudges, the review claimed, were likely left by family members or the coroner's removal team when they first dealt with the body. As for the piece of Corey's scalp left behind, the RCMP acknowledged it as an unfortunate accident by the cleanup crew. It was also admitted that it was equally unfortunate that police hadn't informed the Sherbys about this quote-unquote mishap. These admissions did little to satisfy the family, and the official stance remained that Corey's death was a tragic, self-inflicted accident. The family ended up hiring an independent forensic expert from the United States. This American medical doctor examined the available records and photographs and concluded that Corey likely died as a result of a violent altercation, not an overdose. Armed with this expert opinion, the Sherbys intensified their campaign for justice. They spoke to the media, resulting in multiple newspaper articles that kept Corey's story in the public eye. The Sherbys also reached out to police oversight bodies. They filed complaints with the Commission for Public Complaints against the RCMP, which at one point recommended that the RCMP do some further investigation into the case. In May 2019, British Columbia's Minister of Public Safety agreed that the case warranted this deeper public scrutiny and announced that he was holding a coroner's inquest. Over several days, the inquest at the Burnaby Coroner's Court heard from witnesses and reviewed evidence. The jury was presented with the forensic reports, the photographs of the scene, and accounts from both the initial investigators and those the family had later brought in. After careful deliberation, the coroner's jury returned their verdict on November 5th, 2020. In the end, they concluded that Corey Sherby's death was accidental, caused by acute coke and alcohol toxicity, exactly what the original autopsy had found. The inquest did not find sufficient evidence to reclassify the death as a slaying. However, the inquest jury did acknowledge the problems with the case. They made a single, pointed recommendation to the RCMP, suggesting that policies and procedures needed to be revised to collect all evidence in any death investigations. And yes, you heard me correctly. You don't need to rewind that one. They had to tell the RCMP, hey guys, perhaps you should collect evidence, rather than simply doing nothing. In essence, the jury recognized that the investigation in 2011 had likely missed or lost evidence, and they wanted the police to learn from this failure. Importantly, without properly collected contemporaneous evidence, the coroner's inquest essentially had its hands tied as to the conclusion. And it really seems like a self-fulfilling verdict to me. Since the RCMP only gathered enough evidence initially to prove it was an accidental overdose, the result of the inquest was, unsurprisingly, that it was accidental. Personally, I think there's significant reasons to think that Corey's death was suspicious. Now, of course, that doesn't actually mean there was any foul play involved. But still, investigators owed it to him and his family to properly investigate the scene. Unfortunately, some detective got it in their mind that this was accidental and simply stopped meaningfully investigating at that point. You can't even begin to imagine what I've been through, Marilyn Bergeron told her close friend in late 2007, eyes filled with tears and fear. Just weeks later, on a cold Sunday morning in February 2008, the 24-year-old Canadian woman walked out of her parents' home and was never seen again. Her haunting last words and inexplicable disappearance have perplexed investigators and loved ones for over 17 years. How could a young woman simply vanish in broad daylight, leaving behind only cryptic clues and unanswered questions? This is the mystery of what exactly happened to Marilyn Bergeron, the disturbing twists and turns along the way, and why she actually may still be alive. Marilyn Bergeron was born on December 21, 1983, in Chicoutimi, Quebec in Canada, and grew up with a passion for music and adventure. By her teens, she was singing, playing instruments, and even trying to start bands in school. Friends and family recall Marilyn as vibrant and open-minded. She loved exploring different cultures and languages, becoming fluent in both French and English, and acquiring a basic proficiency in Spanish and Russian. Also, for those unaware, Quebec is the part of Canada where people generally only speak French in day-to-day life. After college, Marilyn set out to pursue her dreams in the big city of Montreal. In 2005, at age 21, She moved to Montreal, where she landed a job at a major music store and did freelance sound editing for TV shows. Ever ambitious, she also started training in finance and talked of becoming a flight attendant and moving to Western Canada one day. Despite her talents and bright plans, Marilyn's life in Montreal wasn't all smooth sailing. She lived in the Hochelaga Maisonneuve district, a neighborhood known for poverty, drugs, and crime, and she began hanging out with a bit of a rough crowd. According to those who know her, Marilyn took up a you-only-live-once 80s rock star type of lifestyle. By late 2007, Marilyn's loved ones noticed a drastic change in her. The once upbeat young woman had grown withdrawn, fearful, and sad, as if burdened by a secret trauma. Something had happened to Marilyn in Montreal. Something so terrifying that she abruptly decided she could no longer stay there. In early February 2008, Marilyn phoned her mother in tears and begged to come home to Quebec City, saying she didn't feel safe living alone in Montreal anymore. She cryptically promised to tell her mom why when she got back, but refused to give details at that time. On February 10th, 2008, Marilyn packed a bag and fled Montreal, catching a bus back to her parents' house in Quebec City that very day. Over the next week at home, Marilyn's behavior alarmed her family. She was jumpy, distraught, and would often break down crying without explanation. Her mother gently pressed Marilyn to reveal what had shaken her so badly in Montreal. She went along all the usual lines of questioning, trying to figure out if she had substance abuse problems, debt issues, or boyfriend troubles, but Marilyn insisted she didn't. Finally, her mom asked the unthinkable. Had her daughter been assaulted in some way? At that, Marilyn fell silent, her face twisting in pain as tears flowed, an answer in itself, and her mother suggested that she talk to a psychologist. Despite her inner turmoil, Marilyn tried to regain some normalcy that week. She quit her Montreal job, retrieved her remaining belongings with her parents' help, and attempted to move on. By Saturday, February 16th, 2008, she had officially moved back in with her family, seemingly ready to start fresh in her hometown. However, sadly, Marilyn never got that fresh start, and the very next morning, she would vanish without a trace. Sunday, February 17th, 2008, began like an ordinary winter morning in Quebec City, but it would become infamous as the day Marilyn Bergeron disappeared. At around 10 that morning, Marilyn came downstairs dressed to go out. She wore gray velvet pants, tall black suede boots, and a long black overcoat with faux fur trim on the hood. Her parents were surprised when Marilyn said that she was heading out for a walk. Marilyn had been home for just one day, and with everything that had been going on, they expected her to chill out a bit. Her mom asked if she could join her daughter on the walk, but Marilyn insisted on going alone. Before leaving, Marilyn made a point of taking along a credit card her father had given her for emergencies. Interestingly, though, she left behind all her other ID and personal documents. With a quick promise to be back that afternoon, Marilyn walked out the door into the chilly February air, leaving her worried mother on the doorstep, wondering what was happening. Hours passed with no sign of Marilyn, and unbeknownst to her family, Marilyn's short walk turned into a mysterious odyssey across the city that day. She appeared all over Quebec City on surveillance video throughout the day, appearing visibly nervous throughout. She was noted to be continuously looking over her shoulder, as if she thought she was being followed. She also attempted to withdraw money from an ATM, but entered her PIN incorrectly a number of times. At 4 p.m., nearly 5 hours after the ATM sighting, Marilyn popped up over 10 miles away. She entered a coffee shop in the Saint-Romuald area of Lévis, a town just across the river from Quebec City, and bought herself a coffee with a credit card. The transaction timestamp and a barista's memory confirmed Marilyn was indeed there, alone, looking depressed and in a hurry to leave. This brief cafe visit is the last confirmed sighting of Marilyn Bergeron. After that, she vanished. Marilyn did not return home that evening, and she has never been seen or heard from since, and her credit card was never used again either. The distance between Marilyn's house and that coffee shop is significant, roughly 15 miles, including a bridge across the wide frozen river. It would have been an arduous trek on foot in the middle of a notoriously cold Canadian winter, and Marilyn wasn't dressed for a long hike through snow. Her family strongly believes she didn't walk there herself. They suspect someone gave her a ride, or that she hitched a lift with a stranger. Notably, some believe that she may have been looking back at a vehicle while she was doing that ATM transaction, though this hasn't been confirmed. Marilyn's parents reported her missing to the police that night, and surprisingly, the investigation kicked into gear quickly. I'm so used to having to say that nothing was done for the first 2 or 3 days, but thankfully, this wasn't the case here, which is why so much evidence could be preserved. Despite exhaustive efforts in 2008, no meaningful leads surfaced immediately. The winter snow eventually melted, seasons changed, and still the Bergeron family had no answers. In fact, nearly 2 years passed in silence before a potential break in the case finally emerged. In January 2010, veteran crime reporter Claude Poirier received an unusual phone call from a man in Hawkesbury, Ontario. This is a small, predominantly French-speaking town right on the border of Quebec and Ontario. This caller claimed he recognized Marilyn Bergeron. He said he had seen her frequently over the past year in Hawkesbury, always accompanied by the same young man. According to this tipster, Marilyn appeared to be living in the area, moving around town from place to place with that man. Others in Hawkesbury backed up his story. Some regulars at a local restaurant believed they had also spotted Marilyn dining there with a man after being shown her photograph. Some of these reports painted an unsettling picture. Marilyn looked under pressure and almost captive during these sightings. The Hawkesbury sightings in 2009 to 2010, if true, suggested that Marilyn might have remained alive for at least a year after vanishing and had traveled far from Quebec City. It also raised the chilling possibility that she was being held against her will across provincial lines. Her family took this information seriously and urged police to investigate the Ontario leads. Quebec City police did check out the tips, even collaborating with Ontario authorities, but frustratingly, nothing conclusive came of it. Law enforcement remained as baffled as ever, and officially Marilyn's status stayed missing. The authorities maintained that there was still no proof of any crime having occurred, nor proof that Marilyn was alive or dead. By 2016, nearly a decade had gone by, and the Bergeron family's frustration was palpable. They decided to take bold action. They hired Marc Bellemare, a former Quebec Minister of Justice, as their lawyer to advocate for Marilyn's case. His involvement brought renewed media attention, and he held 2 press conferences in 2017. The first press conference announced a confidential tip line that anyone could call with information. The second conference announced that tips did indeed flood in, and revealed that 43 new sightings of Marilyn had been reported in the months since the family's outreach. While many of these could not be verified, they reinforced one crucial point. People across Quebec and Ontario thought they saw Marilyn, keeping hope alive that she might still be out there. It was at this time that a key witness, Marilyn's old college friend Jonathan Gauthier, finally shared a startling story that shed light on her secret trauma. Gauthier's account took everyone back to that fateful night in December 2007 when he met Marilyn in Montreal, only weeks before she vanished. Reconnecting after months apart, he was shocked at Marilyn's depressed state when he arrived at her apartment. She was sitting in the dark, listening to melancholy music. They went to a party together, and there Marilyn ran into another friend. Something about that encounter triggered Marilyn's anxiety. She became agitated and asked Gauthier to take her home immediately. Back at her place, Marilyn broke down sobbing uncontrollably. Gauthier spent hours trying to console her and find out what was wrong. Gauthier recalled Marilyn saying he couldn't even imagine what she'd been through, and that she wouldn't tell him because she didn't want to put him in danger. This chilling conversation was the last time he ever saw his friend. Hearing it retold in 2017, Marilyn's family and the public now understood just how petrified she had been of whatever happened in Montreal. Despite new information and the family's tireless advocacy, the mystery still lingered, and this new witness reinforced what Marilyn had said to her own parents. Then, in October 2022, nearly 15 years after Marilyn disappeared, another dramatic twist emerged. At a press conference held in Hawkesbury, Mark Bellemare and Marilyn's parents introduced a key witness named Guy Salico, who had come forward with an eerie story. Salico recounted that on one cold, rainy night in December 2009, a young woman had knocked on his door in Hawkesbury at about 2 or 3. The woman was shivering, soaked from the rain, and dressed in just a light jacket, a white t-shirt, jeans, and high heels. Clearly not attire for the winter weather. She was crying and asked if she could use the phone to call someone in town. Salico and his partner brought the distressed visitor inside, gave her a towel to dry off, and let her make a phone call. The call didn't seem to go through to anyone. When they offered to drive her wherever she needed, the young woman refused a ride, saying the address was close by. She stayed about 10 to 15 minutes, apologizing for disturbing them, then headed back out into the dark, rainy night on foot. At the time, Salico didn't recognize the girl at his door. Only a few months later, when he saw a news segment about Marilyn Bergeron's disappearance, did it click. He believed it was Marilyn herself who had stood in his doorway that night. The woman had been blonde, whereas Marilyn was naturally brunette. But Marilyn's family confirmed she sometimes dyed her hair blonde. Salico reported this incident to the Quebec City Police back in 2010, but it was kept confidential and never made public until the 2022 press conference. Notably, the fact that this was kept confidential is one of the factors that leads some people to believe that Marilyn is indeed still alive, but I'll get to that shortly. Hearing Salico's story, Marilyn's mother became convinced that the desperate woman was indeed her daughter. If that is true, it means Marilyn was alive and on the move nearly 2 years after she disappeared, and perhaps trying to reach out for help. Following Salico's revelations, the Bergeron family stated they had gathered other new information that leads them to believe Marilyn may still be alive. Notably, both they and the investigators have decided not to make this information publicly available. However, they believe that she is possibly living somewhere in Ontario under a different identity. They made a heartfelt plea through the media. If Marilyn is out there and wishes to remain hidden, they'll stop searching and respect her wish. They just need to know she's safe. Given the amount of twists and turns in this case, it should come as no surprise that there are a number of theories of what happened to Marilyn. From early on, Quebec City Police considered the possibility that Marilyn might have done it herself. Their reasoning stemmed from her evident emotional distress and the fact that she left home abruptly without identification. Marilyn's family has publicly stated in the past that they strongly believe she met with foul play. One scenario is that a random predator, possibly a stranger, took advantage of her vulnerable state. Perhaps she accepted a ride from a kindly appearing motorist that afternoon, only for that person to have sinister intentions. Another possibility is that Marilyn fell victim to a trafficking ring or criminal organization. Montreal's criminal underworld is known to exploit young women, and Marilyn's fear in Montreal could imply she stumbled into some sort of trafficking ring. The Hawkesbury sightings of her with an unknown man who kept her under close watch lend some credence to the idea that she was being held prisoner or controlled. If so, it's chilling to imagine, but not implausible. She might have been trafficked or forced into an abusive situation far from home. Another angle is that the threat to Marilyn was personal. Perhaps an individual she knew and feared in Montreal followed her or arranged to meet her in Quebec City. Marilyn's comment that revealing her secret could put her friend in danger hints that a very dangerous person was involved. Some believe that this could be a controlling stalker ex-boyfriend, and that any unrelated male figure in her life would necessarily be put in danger due to this stalker. Based on Marilyn's parents' latest statements, some believe the most likely scenario now is that she actually intentionally ran away to start a new life. Some missing persons deliberately vanished to escape problems. There have been numerous unconfirmed sightings of her over the years, which suggests she might indeed be living incognito somewhere, likely in Ontario. Perhaps Marilyn felt so unsafe due to whatever happened in Montreal that she decided to completely erase her identity and live under the radar. She might have dyed her hair, changed her name, and cut off all contact to protect herself and her family. In this scenario, the man seen with her in Ontario might have even been helping her hide rather than holding her captive. This could have explained why he seemed hypervigilant while she seemed to be nervous and scared. And just to drive it home, it's notable that at the 2022 conference, Marilyn's mother said, "If Marilyn has a new life, they'll respect that." Notably, the family also chose not to publicly release a number of facts that may prove she is alive and well and living in Ontario. This suggests that there may be very real information that she's out there, and given the high-profile nature of her case, journalists may descend upon Marilyn if she's alive. As for what this evidence could be, it's possible that they've hired private investigators to conduct social media investigations. These investigations could reveal a person who's potentially Marilyn posted on the internet, perhaps on someone else's social media account. Further, some have speculated that the reason that the official investigation appears to have trailed off is that Marilyn was found alive by investigators. If the cops find an adult missing person who has vanished voluntarily, it's not their job to return that person to their parents, or even directly tell them or the public what happened. In the pre-dawn hours of July 17th, 1988, 22-year-old Lisa Moss left a house party near the village of Woodford, Ontario in Canada, and vanished into the darkness. Lisa had recently moved back to her parents' home in Owen Sound just the day before and was 5 months pregnant at the time. That Saturday night, she met up with friends, 2 women and a male acquaintance, for a night out. They left Lisa's green 1976 Plymouth Fury at the male friend's rented farmhouse in Annan, near Woodford, and all carpooled to a party down a long farm lane. Sometime around 4:30 a.m., Lisa and the male friend returned to his farmhouse so she could retrieve her car. Lisa drove off into the rural darkness, turning left out of the driveway, and was never seen again. When Lisa failed to come home, her family and the Ontario Provincial Police began searching the area. 2 days after her disappearance, a farmer discovered Lisa's Plymouth Fury abandoned on a secluded, muddy dirt road near Annan. The scene was ominous. The car was stuck in mud with its doors and trunk left wide open. It looked as though someone had tried desperately to free the vehicle from the muck, as mud was sprayed behind the tires. Inside the car, however, there was no sign of Lisa. Investigators combed the vicinity for clues. In the following weeks, searchers found Lisa's driver's license and some personal belongings discarded in tall grass along a road several miles east of where the car was found. The license lay atop the tall grass, suggesting it had been tossed from a moving vehicle. These discoveries deepened suspicions of foul play. Despite extensive ground and air searches in the rural farms and woods of Gray County, no trace of Lisa herself was found in 1988. In the early stages, the mysterious disappearance of a young woman from a quiet community left residents on edge. That summer of 1988, another local woman had also vanished under puzzling circumstances just weeks earlier, heightening fears of a serial predator. Police received numerous tips and interviewed many people. Originally, 7 possible suspects were identified in Lisa's case, all people in her life or present around the time she went missing. Both Lisa's estranged husband, from whom she had separated 6 months prior, and the male friend she had argued with the night before, were looked at but were not considered suspects. Investigators conducted over 150 interviews in the case and pursued leads across the region. Sadly, despite all these initial efforts, her case went cold. By 2009, the investigation, now handled by the OPP's Cold Case Unit, had honed in on a single suspect after years of work. The authorities conducted multiple searches of a particular property in Owen Sound, starting in 2010, using both forensic teams and ground-penetrating radar. Despite these efforts, no meaningful evidence was turned up in the search. Over the years, several theories have emerged about what happened to Lisa Moss, all of which involve foul play. From the evidence, detectives strongly suspect Lisa met with harm at the hands of someone she trusted. While investigators have not named a primary suspect, there is significant suspicion on the male friend who was last with her in the early morning of July 17th. This man, a casual acquaintance who gave Lisa a ride to her car, was among those questioned early on. However, without concrete evidence, no charges have ever been laid. Other early suspects, including Lisa's ex-husband and former boyfriend, were cleared by police and are no longer thought to be involved. However, some suggest that the police may not have looked closely enough into these individuals to rule them out. Another theory is that she was abducted by a stranger after her vehicle became caught in the mud. According to this theory, someone may have pulled over under the guise of helping her, or she may have wandered off to try to find help, only to encounter a real-life monster. All that said, there's no evidence that a random stranger abducted Lisa, but authorities haven't been able to fully rule it out. One major fact I wasn't able to conclusively uncover when I was researching this case is who the father of her baby was. Sadly, pregnant women are at a greatly elevated risk of violence, and this violence is almost always directed at them from the individual who got them pregnant. At any rate, it sounds as though the police likely have a very good idea who committed this act, but simply don't have the key evidence they need to prosecute the crime. For the time being, Lisa remains officially classified as a missing person until evidence proves otherwise. Robert Kamu was, by all accounts, a respectable individual leading a quiet life in Brant County, Ontario in Canada. He worked as a welder at a fabrication company in nearby Cambridge and rented part of a house on West River Road in the community of Paris, Ontario. The last day anyone saw Robert was Sunday, March 31st, 1996, Easter Sunday. He spent that day around his home on West River Road. In the late afternoon, around 5 p.m., a neighbor's daughter noticed Kamu outside changing a tire on his truck. By early evening, that same neighbor grew concerned. She hadn't seen Robert since and decided to check on him, and what she found has haunted the community ever since. Around 7 p.m., the neighbor arrived at Kamu's residence and discovered the front door wide open, with music blaring from inside on repeat. According to reports, the song on repeat was by the band Hootie and the Blowfish, though I wasn't able to find out which song it was. I'm not overly familiar with this band, but my understanding from a quick Spotify journey is that their songs are fairly upbeat in general. Given the theories about what happened, let's just say that the type of music playing may have provided some further insight into Robert Kamu's headspace. But I digress. Stepping inside, the neighbor found Kamu's dog alone in the house. The loyal pet was unharmed except for a small cut on her head, suggesting she may have been struck or injured during whatever transpired. Oddly, Kamu's wallet was still in the house and his pickup truck sat in the driveway. It appeared he hadn't planned to go anywhere far. Scattered CDs littered the floor as if there had been a disturbance. Outside, the driveway revealed peculiar tire tracks, as though another vehicle had peeled away at high speed. Alarmed, the neighbor ventured down toward the nearby banks of the Grand River, a spot Robert often frequented on walks with his dog, and called out for him into the dusk. With darkness closing in and Robert still nowhere to be found, the neighbor contacted the Brant County, Ontario Provincial Police to report him missing. By the next morning, April 1st, it was evident that Robert Kamu had truly vanished. When he failed to show up for work at his welding job that Monday, those who knew him grew even more concerned. Simply put, Robert wasn't the sort of person to go AWOL from his responsibilities, so this was incredibly out of character. Police officers had already been alerted by the neighbor's call the night before, and they arrived at Kamu's home to investigate the strange scene. They found the door still ajar, the stereo still looping the same song, and Kamu's dog anxiously waiting for her owner. There were no signs of Robert himself. It was as if he had stepped out briefly and intended to return, but something prevented him from coming back. The Brant County OPP immediately launched an intensive search of the area. They brought in a canine unit to track Robert's scent, hoping the dogs might lead them to a clue in the surrounding fields or along the riverbank. Unfortunately, heavy rain had started that evening, and the downpour washed away any reliable scent trails that might have existed. Undeterred, authorities called in a helicopter to scan the region from above, and officers on foot combed through brush, woods, and along the cold, swift waters of the Grand River. Despite these efforts, no trace of Robert was found that night or in the days immediately following. As the investigation unfolded, police canvassed the neighborhood and spoke with those who knew Robert. Investigators interviewed his family members, friends, co-workers, and acquaintances, trying to piece together any hints of what might have happened or where he could be. Nothing in Kamu's financial records or personal life offered an obvious lead. For instance, there were no sudden bank withdrawals, no suspicious notes left behind, and no known conflicts with enemies. In fact, as a result of the investigation, it came out that he didn't seem to have any enemies to speak of whatsoever. That said, that didn't mean all was well in his life. He had been described as feeling despondent in the time leading up to his disappearance, grappling with the fallout of a romantic relationship, and worry over a relative's serious illness. In fact, Robert had recently asked his on-and-off girlfriend to marry him, and she had declined his proposal, which hurt him deeply. Still, those close to him insist he was coping, and had even mentioned future plans. These personal struggles led some to wonder if Robert might have simply left of his own accord, or chose to end himself in despair, but evidence for those theories was scarce. Early on, police received one intriguing tip. There were reports that just days before he vanished, Robert Kamu had been seen in the company of two unidentified men driving a pickup truck. According to a neighbor's recollection, on the weekend prior to his disappearance, two men, believed to be fellow welders, had come by to visit Robert at his home. It struck her as a bit odd, as she wasn't sure why they would visit. Now, personally, I don't see what sounds so odd about a welder having two welders show up at his house. People tend to socialize with people in their own profession, but regardless, this lead appears to have been taken as significant by investigators. Also, I'm not entirely certain how the neighbor was so certain that the men were welders, but once again, I digress. And as always, it's important to note that, for open investigations, we simply don't have access to all the evidence, and there may be a reason why this event has been given so much weight. This lead suggested that Kamu's disappearance might not have been entirely accidental, and perhaps these individuals knew something about where he went or what happened. The police appealed to the public for any information about these two men, hoping they might come forward or be identified. Unfortunately, that avenue didn't immediately solve the case. The identities and intentions of those men in the pickup truck remain unknown to this day, and it's not confirmed if they were connected to Robert's fate in any way. Weeks turned into months, and still there was no sign of Robert Kamu. Over the years, the case gradually grew cold, though law enforcement continued to keep Kamu in their missing persons database and would periodically revisit the file as tips trickled in. At one point, in the late 1990s, Kamu's brother even sought out the help of a psychic in desperation. The psychic claimed to have a vision that Robert was struck on the head with a shovel and buried in a shallow grave on his own property. This gruesome suggestion prompted the family to arrange a thorough search of the grounds around the house. They brought in specialized equipment capable of detecting disturbances under the soil, hoping to find any hint of a burial site. The exhaustive search, however, yielded nothing, absolutely no remains, and no clues. The psychic who offered this quote-unquote assistance ghosted them afterwards, leaving the family to believe they had been taken in by a grifter. In the absence of concrete evidence, a number of theories have been debated about what happened to Robert Kamu. Officially, the Brant County OPP has never declared the case a slaying or an accident. It remains an open missing person investigation. One possibility considered early on was that Robert, distraught over personal problems, might have chosen to leave his life behind voluntarily. According to his friends, Robert had once dated a woman who later assumed a new identity and essentially vanished to start life anew. Some have theorized that Robert was aware that disappearing was indeed possible because of this experience. In theory, he could have decided to do something similar, walking away from his job, family, and everything he knew to begin again somewhere else under a different name. His family holds on to a glimmer of hope that this could be the case, dreaming that perhaps he is out there living quietly under a new identity. Another theory suggests that Kamu may have walked away from his life in a very literal way, given his emotional state around that time. Investigators learned he was upset about his girlfriend rejecting his marriage proposal and worried about a close relative's cancer diagnosis. Depression and despair might have overwhelmed him. If he had chosen to end himself somewhere in the remote countryside or the river, that might explain why he was never found. However, supporters of this theory acknowledge a major counterpoint. No physical evidence has ever surfaced, despite extensive searching. Further, those who knew him didn't think that he would simply leave his dog abandoned and helpless. They've also questioned why he wouldn't leave a note to explain the situation to his family and friends. That said, people don't always leave these notes, and oftentimes they're in a mental state where they truly believe no one will miss them, even if this is the furthest thing from reality. Another theory suggests that he may have met his end accidentally. Those familiar with the area note that there are old open wells that are essentially concealed in the rural countryside that could function as traps. Some speculate that he may have gone for a country stroll to work off some stress or frustration, gone off the beaten path, and fallen into one of these wells. Many lean toward a more sinister explanation: foul play at the hands of others. The clues at the scene hint at a possible confrontation. The hurried tire tracks could indicate another vehicle leaving in a rush, and the dog's minor injury raises questions about a scuffle. Many believe that the loyal pooch may have come to the defense of her owner and been beaten back by the assailants. This theory tends to turn upon the two unidentified men in the pickup truck as being the responsible individuals. Theorists have speculated that perhaps an argument or unexpected incident occurred that resulted in Robert being taken away against his will. Because Kamu lived in a somewhat rural area, it's conceivable that if a crime occurred, the perpetrators had the cover of seclusion to do it quietly. Without solid evidence, no theory can be proven, and at present, the case of Robert Kamu remains a disturbing unsolved mystery with no resolution in sight. In early 2023, a chilling mystery unfolded in the Greater Toronto area. A 53-year-old Chinese-born Canadian lawyer named Isabella Dan left her Markham condominium one March evening and was never seen again. Friends grew concerned when they couldn't reach her, and soon the disappearance of this successful professional would captivate the public and confound investigators. But new details emerged, hinting at dark complications beneath the surface, and perhaps this apparently successful attorney wasn't who she said she was. On March 3, 2023, Isabella Dan was last seen around 8:30 p.m. near her home at a condo building in Markham, Ontario, just north of Toronto. Surveillance cameras captured her leaving her residence at Waterwalk Drive and Verclair Gate, a newly developed area in Markham. That night, Isabella wore a distinctive beige coat with a fur-trimmed collar, black pants, and carried a red gym bag, the kind of detail that would later help witnesses recall seeing her. She stepped into a gray Porsche Cayenne SUV driven by a business associate waiting out front, departing from her building shortly after 8 p.m. According to police, this associate later told investigators he dropped Isabella off to meet another person at an unspecified location. Beyond approximately 8:45 p.m. that night, Isabella Dan vanished without a trace. When work associates realized they couldn't reach Isabella in the days after March 3rd, concern quickly mounted. It was unlike her to fall completely out of contact, especially given her professional responsibilities. By March 9th, York Regional Police publicly announced Isabella as a missing person. Responding officers canvassed the area around her condo and soon discovered Dan's personal vehicle, a gray Land Rover SUV, abandoned on a street near her building. Strikingly, the Land Rover was not parked in the condo's underground garage where she would normally keep it, but out on the street in front of the building. Inside her home, police found signs of an interrupted routine. There was fresh food left out and personal items left behind in a manner that friends described as out of character. The stage was set for an investigation into what was looking less like a voluntary absence and more like something sinister, at least according to the police. York Regional Police quickly deemed the circumstances of Isabella Dan's disappearance suspicious. Throughout the spring of 2023, police made repeated public appeals, hoping to generate leads. Detectives asked anyone who had been in the relevant areas on March 3rd to check for any dashcam or security footage that might have captured Isabella or the vehicles involved. Officers also reached out to members of her gym, since Dan was known to be an avid member of a fitness club near her home. Perhaps someone from her regular workout class had chatted with her in the days prior, or knew of plans she'd mentioned. This outreach proved fruitless, as it turned out that Isabella Dan was a very private individual. Even months into the case, police admitted they struggled to find people in her life who could offer any meaningful personal insights. The friends she knew were all work associates, but they could only speak to her quote-unquote good work ethic, but they couldn't comment on anything in her personal life whatsoever. The cops came out and publicly admitted that her personal life was entirely a mystery to them. As police dug deeper, troubling facts about Isabella Dan's professional affairs began to surface. It turned out that at the time she went missing, Dan was entangled in serious legal and financial problems of her own. She was facing at least 4 active civil lawsuits involving allegations of mortgage fraud in the Greater Toronto area. Court documents filed with the Ontario Superior Court showed that multiple clients had alleged that she was duped into participating in real estate loan schemes. In essence, these lawsuits allege that Dan had inadvertently helped arrange or facilitate fake mortgage loans on several Toronto area properties. Notably, the allegations were for professional negligence rather than anything actually fraudulent on her part. In essence, the allegations were that she had been targeted by fraudsters on the basis that she wasn't doing her due diligence in real estate transactions. Notably, the Law Society of Ontario, which oversees lawyers in the jurisdiction, had been investigating Dan for professional misconduct by the time she disappeared. This investigation, along with potential disciplinary action, was separate from the civil lawsuits she faced. To put it mildly, Isabella Dan appears to have found herself between a rock and a hard place. To date, no definitive evidence has surfaced to explain what happened to Isabella Dan after that fateful March evening. Investigators and the public have grappled with 2 primary theories, each with unsettling implications. The first, and the one police themselves lean toward, is that Dan met with foul play. In other words, she was harmed or abducted by someone because of circumstances surrounding her professional life. Perhaps someone who lost a great deal of money lured Isabella to that mysterious meeting on March 3rd under false pretenses. The fact that she was dropped off to meet an unknown person at an imprecise location that night stands out as deeply suspicious. Investigators have never identified the person she was supposedly going to meet, nor have they clarified the purpose of that meeting. Further, because it's an active, ongoing investigation, there's been no information revealed about who this business associate was, who drove her to the meeting. Some have speculated that this was a fellow attorney, but ultimately this remains unknown, at least to the general public. Notably, it's also quite odd that this person apparently doesn't remember where he dropped her off. The other theory discussed, both by investigators and by observers, is that Isabella Dan's disappearance may have been self-engineered. Essentially, that she chose to go into hiding to escape the mounting pressures in her life. In the initial phase of the investigation, the cops publicly acknowledged they couldn't rule out the possibility that Dan disappeared purposely on her own. It's an idea that often arises when someone vanishes amid legal or financial turmoil. Facing potential lawsuits, professional ruin, and possible disciplinary action from the Bar Association, Isabella could have decided that her only way out was to flee. Those who entertain this theory point to her knowledge of legal systems and the fact she had multiple aliases. Police revealed that Dan went by other names including Rui Dan, Rurin Dan, and even Rachel Dan in some circles. While these have been reported as aliases by some, others have observed that the practice of having multiple names is common amongst Chinese people. This practice often extends to choosing a Western given name as well. Given that Isabella was born in China and had no family connections in Canada, with all her connections remaining overseas, many speculate she simply fled the country. Notably, some family members in China have reached out to the York Regional Police out of concern for Isabella. This has led to two separate interpretations: that these family members are genuinely concerned for Isabella, or that they've been put up to it. Of course, based on the evidence, it's simply impossible to say what the case is. That said, it appears that none of her family members have come to Canada to look for her, which I find somewhat unusual. That said, it sounds like she may have been the sort of person who was socially isolated to begin with, and maybe this extended to familial relationships as well. On a cold winter day in February 1978, 19-year-old Mary Frances Gregory stepped into a car with a friend and set off from her hometown of Parry Sound in Ontario, Canada. She was headed for what she imagined would be a dream vacation in California, but she would never come home. Mary Frances Gregory's disappearance remains one of the most baffling cold cases to straddle the United States and Canada. More than 4 decades later, her fate is still unknown, leaving her family and investigators with more questions than answers. Mary was a 19-year-old resident of Parry Sound, a small, close-knit town on the shores of Georgian Bay in Ontario, Canada. Born on May 27, 1958, she was a young adult with her whole life ahead of her when she decided to embark on a trip to California. Like many teenagers of her era, she was excited for adventure, specifically a vacation to sunny California, a state which has an almost mythical level of magnetism for tourists. For reasons that aren't entirely known, her chosen destination was Palo Alto. Mary left Parry Sound on February 15, 1978, to begin her trip to California. She didn't travel alone. Accompanying her was a male acquaintance, described as a friend, who had agreed to drive her to the United States. The pair reportedly crossed the border via New York State on February 18, 1978. From there, according to the man's account, they embarked on a zigzagging road trip across the country. This indirect path, rather than a more direct route to California, has drawn scrutiny. At any rate, he later told authorities that he drove with Mary through New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and then finally reaching Nevada. This trip took place over 10 days and covered approximately 2,500 miles. Nearly 2 weeks after leaving Canada, the man claimed he dropped Mary off alone at a bus station in Las Vegas on February 28, 1978. This Las Vegas bus station drop-off is the last reported point where Mary was seen. However, it's important to note that this detail comes solely from the companion's account. Mary herself wasn't definitively cited by any independent witnesses in Las Vegas. No public explanation has ever been given for why Mary would have been left at a Las Vegas bus depot when her intended destination in California was still over 500 miles away. Mary never arrived in Palo Alto, or at least was never confirmed to be there, and was never heard from again. She had been carrying luggage on the trip, but her bags were never found after her disappearance. While some people find this part odd, personally, I find this to be the least unusual part of the case, since luggage gets lost all the time in travel and just ends up discarded. Her family received no calls or letters from her after she left home, and she simply vanished somewhere on the journey to her California dream. The disappearance of Mary Frances Gregory has been handled primarily by the Ontario Provincial Police in Canada. However, her case was also entered into California's missing persons records, given that Palo Alto was her intended destination. Notably, however, Mary is not listed as a missing person in Nevada, which raises questions about the legitimacy of the Las Vegas bus station account. Authorities have never publicly named the male travel companion who was with Mary, but police did speak with him, and he provided the cross-country travel story. His account remains the only version of events, and no independent witnesses have confirmed seeing Mary in Las Vegas or anywhere beyond her departure from Canada. Investigators have kept most details of the case confidential, and without concrete evidence of a crime, no arrests have been made. Without this concrete evidence, several theories have emerged about what might have happened to Mary, since the case is just so ripe for speculation. One possibility is that her companion's story was virtually entirely false. Skeptics wonder if Mary ever made it as far as Las Vegas, or if something befell her earlier in the trip. If the man harmed her somewhere along the way, he might have fabricated the bus station drop-off as a cover story. For instance, it's unclear why he would have left Mary in Nevada instead of driving her the rest of the way to California, a detail that many find deeply suspicious. The fact that Mary's bags disappeared with her, never turning up at any bus depot or with any lost luggage, reinforces the idea that she met with foul play. Many are skeptical that Mary even left Canada at all, and that perhaps the companion did something to her before even leaving the country. Notably, it's never been confirmed that the two ever crossed the border. In the 1970s, it was possible to cross the border just by swearing an oral declaration that you were indeed a Canadian citizen. Absolutely no identification was required whatsoever, and record keeping at the border for non-commercial travel was absolutely minimal. Some have suggested that the male companion may have taken Mary in an entirely different direction. While going south from Parry Sound leads to the metropolis of Toronto, going north from this town leads to vast wilderness. Further, Parry Sound itself has thousands of small, deep lakes, many of which are only accessible by foot or by plane. If the companion used a local lake as a dump site, it's entirely possible that this lake may be holding this dark secret until this day. As the last person to see her, the unnamed companion remains a focus of suspicion to this day in the minds of many, though authorities have never publicly labeled him a suspect. Another theory is that the friend was telling the truth about leaving Mary in Las Vegas, and that she fell victim to a stranger afterward. If Mary truly arrived alone in Las Vegas on February 28, 1978, she may have tried to continue on to California by herself. The late 1970s saw many young travelers come to harm while hitchhiking or trusting strangers. Mary could have been picked up by a predator that left her missing without a trace. Her family, for their part, believes that she may have had a dissociative fugue and simply went on to live a new life after this period of amnesia. I can see why this idea would be very attractive to her family members, as this is something that can legitimately happen. This theory would allow Mary to both be alive and living her best life, while having not ever intentionally abandoned her family. However, it's important to remember these states are extremely rare and usually only last a couple weeks at most. So while it may be comforting, it doesn't seem likely. Further yet, this scenario becomes even more unlikely when you take into account the surrounding circumstances with the male companion she was with. While both Ontario and California have open investigations into this case, given the jurisdictional issues, it's unclear how significant any ongoing efforts are. Unfortunately, it seems that Mary's case largely fell through the jurisdictional cracks and into obscurity. In April 2019, a bush plane droned over the vast subarctic wilderness of Canada's Northwest Territories. Far below, a lone figure and 3 dogs stood beside a remote campsite on the shore of Rolfe Lake. The pilot's passing glimpse of this isolated camp would be the last time anyone saw 63-year-old Glenn Field alive. Glenn was an experienced outdoorsman, a loner who fully embraced life in the wild. He had moved to the Northwest Territories in 2018, determined to make the bush his permanent home. In the fall of that year, he had a charter plane drop him off at Rolfe Lake. This is a remote area only accessible by plane about 100 miles northeast of Yellowknife, the only city in this isolated region. He was dropped off along with his 3 German Shepherd dogs and enough provisions to last the winter. He understood the dangers. Decades earlier, Glenn had lost several toes to frostbite during a solo winter expedition. Nonetheless, he remained determined to live off the land. Indeed, he endured the brutal winter of 2018 to 2019. A passing pilot spotted Field and his dogs at the lakeside camp in April 2019, confirming he was alive and well as the ice began to thaw. Sometime after that April 2019 sighting, Glenn Field vanished without a trace. He never arrived back in Yellowknife, nor did he make his usual periodic check-ins with acquaintances in town as the summer passed. When Field failed to appear or contact anyone by the fall of 2019, those who knew him grew alarmed. The RCMP were alerted, and on October 11, 2019, police issued a public appeal for any information on Field's whereabouts. A missing person investigation was soon underway in the unforgiving terrain where he was last seen. Searchers eventually reached Glenn's campsite later in 2019, only to find it deserted. The camp was neatly packed up, with no garbage or personal items left behind. Just a few tree stumps remained as evidence that he had been there. Nothing indicated when he had left or which direction he went. Crucially, Field's gray canoe was gone, along with all his gear, including his tent, axe, rifle, and his satellite phone. The 3 dogs he arrived with were also nowhere to be found, and there was no trace of them either. As mentioned, he had carried a satellite phone for emergencies, yet no distress call was ever sent from it. All signs suggested he had set off on his planned journey home, but somewhere along the way something had gone very wrong. Despite extensive search efforts, no clear trace of Field was found in the vast wilderness. In the summer of 2020, RCMP conducted further aerial searches and urged anyone traveling in the area to watch for any sign of Field's equipment or dogs. On August 24, 2020, searchers did discover some scattered equipment believed to belong to him near Rolfe Lake. However, there was still no sign of Glenn himself, nor of his canoe or the German Shepherds. With no leads to follow, active search operations were called off in late 2020, leaving the mystery unresolved. The leading theory is that Glenn Field met with a fatal accident during his journey back toward civilization. His brother, Wayne Field, believes Glenn likely capsized his canoe while trying to trek back to Yellowknife with the dogs. A drowning in frigid, wind-swept waters could have taken his life in an instant, even given his expertise. Such a mishap would also explain why neither Glenn, nor his canoe, nor any of the 3 dogs were ever found. Another possibility is that he succumbed to an injury or exhaustion on land before he could find help. He had skis with him to traverse spring ice and snow, so it's conceivable he fell through ice or was hurt while portaging between lakes. Alone in the bush, any serious misfortune could turn deadly without anyone to rescue him. There is no evidence of foul play in this case, and given the remoteness of the area, that scenario is highly unlikely. However, that hasn't stopped speculation that a human predator could have seen this isolated man as a viable target. That said, Glenn was fairly heavily armed and also had 3 tough dogs with him, so he wouldn't have been an easy target. The presence of his 3 German Shepherds would have made it difficult for anyone to ambush him, given the dogs would have been alerted to any camp intruder by scent alone. The authorities also investigated whether he disappeared intentionally to start a new life. Glenn Field was, by all accounts, a bit of an unusual guy to say the least, so him packing it all up and trekking to a new location isn't impossible. He's also the sort of person who would go out of contact with absolutely everyone in his life for extended periods. However, after extensive investigations and following some leads in British Columbia and Canada, the authorities turned up no trace of him and ruled out the idea. In the end, it appears to me that the simplest explanation is the most likely in this scenario, and he very likely had an accident and perished. Glenn took a big risk by heading out into the wilderness alone, and as a very experienced woodsman, he was aware of these challenges. We don't know exactly what the travel corridor was for Glenn's trip back to Yellowknife, but the city is exactly 93 miles from Lake Rolfe. Let's assume for a moment that the travel corridor width was 30 miles, given that there are no trails whatsoever in this area. This would mean that the authorities would have had to investigate approximately 3,000 square miles of densely forested terrain for any sign of Glenn. Putting the math aside for a moment, finding any concrete evidence of Glenn was a virtually impossible task for investigators. This was compounded by the fact that no one even knew when he disappeared for certain. That said, of course, all this ambiguity could be seen to be in favor of the non-accident related theories as well, but Occam's razor definitely applies in this situation. That said, the accident theory does leave some unanswered questions, like why he never used his satellite phone to send a distress call. In my view, this can likely be best explained by a sudden accident on the water, where there would be no opportunity to make any sort of call. In April 2022, 3 years after he disappeared, a Yellowknife court found Glenn to be legally deceased. Officially, however, the RCMP still consider the case open until concrete proof of Glenn's fate is discovered. The vast wilderness may forever hold its secrets. Field's final resting place could lie at the bottom of a lake, or somewhere lost in those woods, never to be found. In the summer of 1996, one man embarked on a frantic journey across North America, convinced he was running for his life. Just days later, he was found deceased in a Tennessee parking lot, surrounded by thousands of dollars in cash and gold that the perpetrator mysteriously left untouched. Authorities were baffled as this man had no known ties to Tennessee, and the way he arrived made as little sense as the way he died. Blair Adams was a 31-year-old construction foreman from Surrey, British Columbia in Canada. By all accounts, he was a hard worker. He had recently returned from a project in Germany and was well regarded in his job at his stepfather's construction company. Adams had battled the bottle in the past, but had been sober for 2 years. In early 1996, however, those close to him noticed alarming changes in his behavior. He abruptly quit his job without even collecting his last paycheck and began exhibiting paranoia and mood swings. He told his mother that people were spreading rumors about him, and told friends that someone was trying to knock him off. By July of 1996, Blair Adams genuinely believed his life was in danger, whether the threat was real or imagined. On Friday, July 5, 1996, Blair Adams took drastic action. He withdrew nearly all the money from his bank account and emptied his safe deposit box of cash, gold, and jewelry. With this small fortune on hand, he abruptly left Canada, convinced he had to escape whoever he feared. That same day, Adams tried to enter the United States by car ferry from Victoria, British Columbia to Seattle. His plan immediately hit a snag. As a lone man carrying a large amount of cash, Adams drew suspicion from U.S. immigration officials, who feared he might be doing something illicit. When they discovered his past minor criminal charges for possession of a controlled substance, they denied him entry at the border. Adams was turned back, thwarting his first attempt to flee Canada. Over the next few days, Blair Adams grew only more desperate. On July 8th, he avoided his own apartment and stayed with his mother, refusing to say exactly what was wrong, but remaining convinced someone wanted him dead. That day, he even bought an expensive round-trip plane ticket to Frankfurt, Germany. possibly to visit a girlfriend he had met while working there, only to cancel it later the same day. His erratic planning suggested he couldn't decide where to run. He seemed to be grasping at any escape route. In the early hours of July 9th, Adams tried once more to cross into the U.S., this time on foot via the Pacific Highway border crossing from British Columbia into Washington state. Border agents noticed that Blair had fresh scratches on his hands and legs, and that he oddly matched the description of a man linked to a recently stolen car found nearby. They briefly detained him, suspecting he might be the car thief, but with no hard evidence, they had to let him go. Once again, Blair Adams was back on Canadian soil, but not for long. Determined to get away, Adams quickly devised a new plan. He drove his own car to the Vancouver airport and left it there, renting a Nissan Altima to make another attempt at the border. This third try was successful. Later on July 9th, Adams finally managed to slip into the United States by car and headed to Seattle. Upon arriving at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, his movements became even more puzzling. He abandoned the rental car at the airport and purchased an overnight one-way plane ticket to the nation's capital. It was a costly and illogical choice. Adams paid more, specifically for a one-way ticket, when agents advised him he could get a cheaper round-trip ticket. Why he chose Washington, D.C., and why he didn't simply fly directly somewhere closer to his perceived safe haven remains unclear. Some have speculated that this bizarre pattern of travel was intended to show off the forces that he perceived to be trailing him. What is clear is that early on July 10th, Blair Adams landed at Dulles International Airport and immediately rented a Toyota Camry for a long road trip. After renting the car, Adams set off driving with no one really knowing his ultimate destination. By that evening, July 10th, 1996, he had traveled about 500 miles southwest to East Tennessee. Around 5:30 p.m., Blair Adams turned up at a gas station off Interstate 40 in the Strawberry Plains area just outside Knoxville. Here he encountered yet another bizarre hurdle. Adams told the gas station staff that he couldn't start his car, believing the key wasn't working. A repair service employee responded to the call for help, and he quickly discovered the simple problem. Blair was using the wrong key for the car. Adams had accidentally grabbed the Nissan key from his previous rental and was trying to use it on the Toyota Camry he was now driving. The employee later recalled that Blair appeared completely confused and irrationally insisted that he had the right key even when it clearly didn't fit. Unable to persuade Adams to simply check his pockets for the correct car key, the employee arranged for the Camry to be towed to a repair shop. He then gave Blair Adams a lift to a nearby motel called the Fairfield Inn. It was now about 7 o'clock at night on July 10th, and Adams had nowhere to go until his car could be sorted out the next day. At the Fairfield Inn, Blair's nervous, erratic behavior continued. He paid $100 cash for a room and even left a $50 deposit for the key. But oddly, he walked away without waiting to get his change back. Over the next 40 minutes, surveillance cameras captured him entering and exiting the hotel lobby 5 separate times before finally heading out of the building for good. According to a hotel employee, Adams appeared paranoid and kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to follow him or show up any moment. He never actually went to the room he'd purchased, and by 7:30 that evening, Blair Adams walked out of the Fairfield Inn's front door for the last time, never to return. What Adams did during the overnight hours of July 10th into July 11th is one of the lingering mysteries of this case. With his car in the shop and his hotel room unused, he was essentially stranded on foot in an unfamiliar city. There were a couple of unconfirmed sightings later that night. Employees at a nearby truck stop claimed they saw a man matching Adams's description around 10 that night. He was reportedly talking to another man about Canadian currency, which strongly bolsters the potential that it was him. Two women also reported seeing him chatting with an unidentified man outside a Cracker Barrel restaurant adjacent to his motel. These leads never panned out, and the descriptions of the mysterious man varied, so investigators couldn't be sure of anything. It wasn't entirely clear if these sightings were Blair, and it wasn't clear either if he was sighted with the same man each time. Notably, a forensic sketch of the man seen with Blair was produced, but this sketch produced no results. Personally, I think this sketch actually looks a lot like Blair himself if he was in a fairly bad state, and I've put their pictures up side by side for comparison. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and feel free to tell me I'm totally off base, since I'm awful with face comparisons. What is known is that at some point that night, Adams got a meal from somewhere because an autopsy later found he had eaten lettuce, meat, and shrimp not long before he died. But beyond those scant clues, Blair Adams's movements in his final hours remain uncertain. Early the next morning, on July 11th, 1996, the tragic culmination of Blair's odyssey came to light. At about 7:30 that morning, a pair of construction workers arrived at their job site and stumbled upon a disturbing sight. Initially, they noticed what looked like a man lying on the ground in the parking lot and assumed he might be a homeless person sleeping there. As they got closer, it became clear the man wasn't asleep at all. He was dead, and the scene was anything but ordinary. The lifeless body was indeed Blair Adams, and he was stripped from the waist down. His pants had been pulled off and lay inside out near his body, along with his socks and shoes. One of his shoes was oddly propped beneath his head, almost like a makeshift pillow, as if someone had placed it there while he was dying. Scattered all around Blair Adams' body was a small fortune in cash. The workers and police who soon arrived found roughly $4,000 in American, Canadian, and German cash in the pockets of his jeans. Nearby was an open fanny pack containing small gold bars, gold and platinum coins, jewelry, and various other valuables Adams had been carrying. Astonishingly, it appeared that nothing had been taken. Whatever happened to Blair that night clearly was not a simple robbery. The rental car's missing key, the one Blair had insisted he couldn't find at the gas station, turned up lying on the ground close to his body, as did the key card for his unused hotel room. It was as if someone had dumped out the contents of his pockets after ending his life, yet chose not to steal a thing. Investigators processed the scene and the body, uncovering more grim details, and found that Blair Adams had been viciously attacked. He had sustained numerous cuts, abrasions, and bruises, and one of his hands was deeply gashed and blackened, as if it had been slammed into the pavement during a struggle. Tufts of his hair had been ripped out, indicating a fierce fight for his life. A later autopsy determined that the fatal blow was a violent impact to his abdomen, and his stomach was ruptured, causing internal bleeding and deadly septic shock. Investigators believe this massive abdominal trauma could have been caused by a very hard kick or even being struck by a vehicle's bumper. Blair also suffered a severe wound to his forehead, likely from a blunt instrument such as a crowbar or club. Certain injuries suggested a possible indecent assault, though the police were never able to recover any biological evidence to prove this. The investigation into Blair Adams's slaying turned up bizarre clues but few solid answers. One perplexing piece of evidence was literally in Blair's hand. Clenched in his fist was a single long strand of hair. The hair didn't appear to be Blair's own, strongly raising the possibility that it came from his attacker during the struggle. Unfortunately, aside from that lone hair, no other DNA or forensic evidence was found at the scene that could identify the perpetrator. It's unclear whether this hair was preserved, since it's theoretically possible that this hair may be able to yield a DNA profile when it wasn't able to in 1996 with the forensic technology then. Police scoured the construction site for a weapon, even testing pieces of metal rebar lying around, but nothing could be definitively linked to the crime. The case had no eyewitnesses to the attack itself. The closest thing to a witness was a security guard at a business nearby, who reported hearing a short, sharp scream around 3:30 on the night of the attack. The guard initially thought it sounded like a woman's scream, and simply went about his business without alerting anyone at the time. As detectives dug into Blair Adam's background and movements, they grew increasingly puzzled. Here was a man far from home, with no clear reason to be in Knoxville. He didn't know anyone in the area and had made no contact with friends or family during his journey. Investigators retraced his steps using receipts and tickets found in Blair's duffel bag at the scene, confirming the odd path he took from Canada to Tennessee. They interviewed his friends and family back in Canada, who uniformly said Blair was not involved in anything illegal. In fact, despite Blair's own fear that someone was after him, authorities began to suspect that this threat might have been largely a product of his own mental state. By all indications, Blair Adams was suffering from paranoia and delusions in the weeks before his death. Tragically, despite appearing to suffer from a mental break, he did end up encountering real deadly danger. Without a clear suspect, several theories have emerged about what might have happened to Blair Adams. One theory favored by the authorities revolves around an indecent assault, which escalated into Blair being attacked. Blair was likely in the midst of psychosis at the time and was processing everything through this delusional framework. It's believed that some miscommunication may have occurred leading to violence. Another theory is that Blair Adams fell victim to a random act of violence. Some have speculated about a robbery attempt gone bad. Maybe Blair fought back fiercely and the attacker panicked and fled without taking the money. The single scream heard at 3:30 in the morning lends credence to a sudden, swift altercation. That said, like all the other theories of the case, there's simply not enough to prove anything. The story of Blair Adams is as haunting as it is baffling. He left behind a trail of clues, from his frantic cross-country movements to the eerie crime scene littered with cash and gold, yet none of it adds up to a coherent answer. The sheriff's office continues to classify the 1996 attack on Blair Adams as an active cold case, holding out hope that new information might one day provide a breakthrough. On a late September afternoon in 1971, 16-year-old Kathy Moulton stepped out of a downtown music shop in Portland, Maine, never imagining it would be the last time anyone saw her. She had promised to be home by 6 that Friday, but Kathy never walked through the door. Her sudden disappearance from a busy Portland street sparked a mystery that has endured for decades. On Friday, September 24th, 1971, Kathy's father dropped her off in downtown Portland so she could run a few errands before a dance that night. She needed to pick up some last-minute items for her outfit. Her father left her on Forest Avenue around 3:30 p.m., and she promised to be home for dinner time. Kathy bought her supplies at a department store and stopped by a music store to visit a friend. Sometime after 5 o'clock, she left the music shop with her shopping bag and a brown leather purse from her recent birthday. That would be the last time anyone was confirmed to see her alive, though there would be disturbing reports about her whereabouts later. When Kathy didn't come home on time, her parents immediately knew something was wrong. She was always punctual, so their concern grew quickly. Her father drove around searching the streets, while her mother frantically called friends and classmates. By nightfall, with no sign of Kathy, the Moultons contacted Portland police, and I bet you might be able to guess what happened next. Police initially brushed them off, suggesting Kathy was probably a runaway and it was too soon to file a report. The distraught parents had to return the next day to get an official missing person report filed. Even then, the case received little attention. A short newspaper item yielded no clues, and police had no idea what happened to Kathy. It's unclear what sort of actual investigation was undertaken by the authorities in this initial disappearance period, if anything. Meanwhile, the family launched their own search. The Moultons hired a private detective and followed every possible tip. They even drove to northern Maine and into New Brunswick, Canada, after alleged sightings of Kathy, but all of these leads ended in disappointment. Nearly 24 years passed with no answers, and in 1995, a Portland police detective named Kevin Cady reopened Kathy's cold case. He soon uncovered evidence that Kathy hadn't run away at all. Cady found that Kathy had been secretly dating a 22-year-old man, Lester Everett, and witnesses confirmed that on the day she vanished, she got into a blue Cadillac with Everett. There was also another young man in the vehicle with the two. The other passenger was a Canadian hitchhiker Everett had offered to drive home to the Tobique First Nation Reserve in New Brunswick, a long trip Kathy probably hadn't expected. Cady traced their route north, and records showed Everett had stolen a car and driven toward Canada on September 24th. In Fort Fairfield, Maine, near the border, a mechanic remembered servicing that car and noticing a quiet teenage girl traveling with two young men. The mechanic even recalled the Canadian man gripping the girl's neck to keep her from wandering, a chilling sign that Kathy was being held against her will. Why this mechanic didn't decide to report this incident at the time is beyond me. Further investigation revealed that Everett and his companion spent some time picking potatoes at a farm in Aroostook County, Maine, after leaving Portland. A woman who was at that farm in 1971 remembered a timid girl named Candy with them, a girl who cried often, stayed apart from others, and said she wanted to go home. It became clear that Candy was Kathy using a false name, frightened and desperate to escape. One night during the harvest, Everett left the farm with Kathy and returned without her. Investigators believe he took her to the Tobique Reservation in Canada and left her there with the other man, though this has never been proven. Soon after, Everett fled Maine. He eventually died in 1986, never revealing anything about Kathy's fate. That left the Canadian acquaintance as likely the last known person to see Kathy. When authorities tracked him down years later, he refused to talk, even when offered immunity. In 1996, a grand jury reviewed the case, but there was not enough evidence to charge anyone. Detectives, however, are convinced that Kathy was slain on the Tobique Reservation fairly soon after she disappeared. Kathy Moulton's disappearance remains one of Maine's oldest unsolved cases. Her father passed away in 2017 without ever learning the truth, but her mother and sisters continue to hope for closure. On July 2, 2011, witnesses on Montreal's Jacques Cartier Bridge saw a young man with striking bright red hair climb over the railing and plunge into the St. Lawrence River. The bridge, busy with summer traffic, briefly became the scene of a desperate emergency. Police and fire crews were alerted immediately, but no rescue was possible once the man disappeared into the waters far below. For days, authorities searched the river without success. Finally, on July 7, 2011, a body matching the description of the jumper was discovered on the river's banks. It was the same red-haired man who had been observed going off the bridge just days earlier. With no identification found on him and no immediate clues to his name, he became known only as the Montreal John Doe of 2011. The victim was a white male estimated to be in his late 20s. He stood around 5'10" and weighed about 160 pounds. Notably, he had distinctive shoulder-length, bright orange-red hair, a pale complexion, and brown eyes. Investigators observed a scar on his right wrist, but no tattoos or other unique marks. The Jacques Cartier Bridge, an imposing steel structure connecting the city to its south shore, has long been infamous as a spot for that activity. Since it opened in the 1930s, hundreds of people have, in their lowest moments, made life-ending decisions at this location. By the early 2000s, it was estimated that over 700 individuals had perished at this bridge, putting it only behind the Golden Gate Bridge in terms of deadliest bridges for this activity. For decades, this led to a grim reality. Approximately 10 people a year perished intentionally in the vicinity of the bridge. In 2004, in response to this disturbing toll, authorities installed a high steel prevention barrier along the pedestrian walkways. This barrier, essentially tall fencing topping the railing, was meant to deter jumpers. The Jacques Cartier Bridge, once an all-too-easy venue for an impulsive tragedy, had become significantly harder to jump from. However, the 2011 John Doe case proved that determined individuals could still find a way. Despite the barrier, this man managed to get over the railing. Montreal authorities treated the case with great urgency and care. The coroner's office conducted an autopsy to confirm the cause of death and look for any clues. The autopsy found no signs of foul play or trauma beyond injuries consistent with a fall from a great height. Investigators gathered every detail they could about the John Doe's appearance and belongings, hoping something might spark recognition. Notably, he had a thin chain bracelet on his left wrist, made of silver-colored metal, with multiple interlocking rings added to extend its length. The bracelet appeared to have a name engraved on it. The word Michel was discernible on the plate. And just for clarity here, that's the French version of the masculine name Michael, rather than the name Michel. He also had what's been described as a Lord of the Rings style ring on one of his fingers. This was a metal band resembling the One Ring from the famous fantasy novels, complete with what looked like elvish script etched into it. He also wore a green elastic band around his left bicep, for reasons which are entirely unclear. From the outset, the engraved name Michel on the bracelet stood out as the strongest potential lead. Was Michel his name? And if so, was it his first name, or perhaps a family name? While it's commonly a French first name, it's not an uncommon surname either. Standard identification procedures were undertaken. Fingerprints were taken from the body and run through databases. DNA samples were collected and stored. The Quebec coroner's office noted that all typical tests were done: digital fingerprinting, DNA profiling, checking dental records, but no matches turned up immediately. For a DNA match, officials would need a known relative's sample for comparison, which they didn't have. Authorities also scoured missing person reports, but no active missing person case in Montreal or in Quebec matched this man's description. In fact, nobody had reported him missing at all. This was a perplexing fact. A man in his late 20s vanished, yet no friends or family had alerted police. Recognizing they had reached a dead end with internal records, Montreal police turned to the public for help. On October 1st, 2011, about 3 months after the incident, an appeal ran in the Montreal Gazette and other media. The police published a blurry image taken of the man showing his face and distinctive red hair. The public appeal generated attention and some tips, but none led to a positive ID. People who saw the news contacted police with various suggestions. Perhaps he was a relative who hadn't been in touch, or a friend they lost contact with. Every lead was checked, but the mystery man's name and story remained elusive. By late 2011, with no solid leads, the John Doe was laid to rest anonymously, his remains stored in case future forensic advances or inquiries might identify him. With all that said, there's been rumors swirling around online in recent days that the Quebec coroner's office may be closing in on the identity of this unknown young man. Like with so many cases I cover, I suspect that the power of genetic genealogy will allow this case to be fully cracked once and for all and give this man his identity back. I hope to have an update on this Montreal John Doe in a future video. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 9th, 1975, a quiet Sudbury, Canada neighborhood hid a chilling secret. A young woman vanished without a trace from her own home. The next morning, 20-year-old Jane Smith's bed was empty and her belongings untouched. This baffling disappearance would leave her family and community haunted for the next 50 years, desperate for answers to what really happened in those fateful hours. Born in 1955, Jane grew up in Newmarket, Ontario, and attended school in the town where she was born. In 1973, she enrolled at Laurentian University in Sudbury to study social work, reflecting her passion for helping others. By 1975, at age 20, she was an aspiring social worker and active student leader, even serving on the student council during her first year at Laurentian. Friends and family recall Jane as energetic and compassionate, someone who wanted to make a difference in the world. The summer of 1975, instead of returning home, Jane chose to stay in Sudbury. She had a job at a local Canadian Tire store, which is a national chain that's essentially a Walmart minus the food with a service center attached. By all accounts, she was happy living in Sudbury, excited about her future, and closely connected to her family back home. There were no signs of trouble in Jane's life as she headed into that August, which makes her sudden disappearance all the more mystifying. On Friday, August 8, 1975, Jane is thought to have gone about her usual routine. There's little record of what she did that evening, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary based on what's been reported. She lived in a small basement apartment on Charlotte Street in Sudbury, which she shared with a roommate. That night, the two young women stayed up late. Around 2 in the morning on August 9th, Jane's roommate saw her in their apartment as Jane was preparing to head to bed. It was the last confirmed sighting of Jane Smith. Sometime in the early morning hours, something went terribly wrong. By 7:30 that Saturday morning, Jane's roommate realized Jane was nowhere to be found in the apartment. Jane's bed was empty, and she was gone without making a sound in the night. Panicked, the roommate searched and then contacted others. Before long, police were notified that Jane was missing. What they found, or rather, did not find, was deeply unsettling. Apart from the clothes Jane had been wearing when she was last seen, all of her personal belongings were left behind in her room. Her purse, identification, and even everyday items a young woman would normally take were untouched. It looked as if Jane had intended to be back soon, or had no chance to gather anything at all. Crucially, Jane's bank accounts were never accessed again after that day. This meant that none of her money was withdrawn or spent, and she didn't contact any friends or family. For investigators, this was a red flag. It strongly suggested that Jane did not plan to leave for long, since she took no money or belongings, and she hadn't simply started a new life elsewhere. It appeared that someone had removed Jane from her home or the surrounding area against her will. In the immediate aftermath of Jane's disappearance, an intensive investigation unfolded. Friends, family, and volunteers scoured the area for any clue. Sudbury police treated the case with urgency. A young woman disappearing from her own home was not something they took lightly. Early on, Jane's family and the local community offered a reward for information. Her distraught parents, along with family friends, put up reward money in hopes of enticing anyone with knowledge to speak up. Jane's fellow students at Laurentian University even organized fundraisers to add to the reward fund. Posters of Jane's smiling face were distributed, and local media covered the story. Despite these efforts, no solid leads emerged, and it was as if whatever happened to Jane had left no witnesses or evidence willing to surface. Initially, two main theories took shape: that Jane was the victim of foul play, or that she left of her own accord. As the weeks and months passed with no sign of Jane, the runaway theory rapidly lost credibility. Tragically, the foul play theory is now widely accepted as the likely explanation. The Greater Sudbury Police have never closed the case, and Jane's case is officially classified as a suspected slaying, albeit without a body to prove it. Without concrete evidence, speculation has run rampant. One possibility is that Jane knew her abductor. Perhaps she stepped outside to meet someone she trusted in those early morning hours and met with harm. It's been theorized that perhaps she had recently started dating a man and hadn't yet told anyone else about him. Under this theory, she may have headed out in the early morning hours to meet up with him, and the encounter turned deadly. Another speculative theory is that she perhaps stepped out in the middle of the night for some fresh air. This would explain why the only thing that was missing was her clothing. While out, under this theory, she was abducted by an assailant who may have been stalking her, waiting for her to emerge from her home. Again, this is speculative, but given how completely she vanished, it's potentially accurate. In the end, the story of Jane Smith is a heartbreaking tale of a young woman who should have had a long, fulfilling life. Her family hasn't given up the search for her and has been able to use the 50th anniversary of her disappearance to bring additional attention to her case. It's likely someone out there, somewhere, knows exactly what happened to Jane on that Sudbury Saturday morning. In the early hours of August 26, 2006, an eerie scene awaited at a remote fire lookout cabin in the forests of Alberta in Canada. A pot of water was left boiling on the stove, its owner nowhere to be found. Outside on the wooden steps, investigators noted what appeared to be a smear of blood, a silent testament that something had gone terribly wrong. This was the home of 70-year-old Stephanie Stewart, a veteran wildfire spotter stationed alone atop the Athabasca Lookout Tower near Hinton. That morning, Stephanie had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only unsettling clues and a mystery that has endured for nearly 2 decades. Stephanie Stewart wasn't a typical 70-year-old by any means, and she appears to have been more active than most people in their 20s or 30s. Friends described her as amazingly fit for her age. She had cycled solo across Canada and summited Mount Kilimanjaro in her late 60s. A mother of one and an avid reader and crafter, Stephanie split her year between winter months in Canmore, a city in Alberta, and summers in the wilderness. For 18 seasons, she worked as a wildfire spotter for Alberta's Forestry Service, and for the last 13 of those years, she returned each spring to the same lookout. This was the Athabasca Tower in William Switzer Provincial Park. There, perched on a high ridge, she lived in a small cabin at the base of a 40-foot observation tower. Every day she climbed the tower ladder to scan the rolling foothills and boreal forest for smoke. It was solitary work, and Stephanie was the only human for miles, but she relished it. On the night of August 25, 2006, Stephanie spoke with family by phone around 9 o'clock, and everything seemed normal. By the following morning, however, alarm bells were ringing. Stephanie failed to make her scheduled radio check-in, a mandatory safety call she reliably made each morning at 8:30 to confirm all was well. When repeated calls to her cabin went unanswered, her supervisor grew concerned. The supervisor tried phoning the lookout several times. Strangely, someone did answer, but each time the receiver was picked up, the person on the other end immediately hung up without a word. After a few such attempts, the line went dead entirely, as if the phone had been unplugged mid-ring. This bizarre phone behavior greatly alarmed Stephanie's supervisor, who knew she was always dutiful with communications. Fearing the worst, he drove out to the Athabasca Tower site that morning. Arriving by roughly 9 a.m., the supervisor found an ominous, perplexing scene. Stephanie's pickup truck was still parked outside the cabin, ruling out the possibility that she had driven off. Inside the small dwelling, a pot of water was boiling away on the stove untended, as if Stephanie had stepped out briefly and intended to return at any moment. A quick search of the area found no sign of the woman, and a complete sense of dread overcame the supervisor. Noticing some out-of-place details, the supervisor contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police immediately, and Stephanie was formally reported missing. Investigators processing the cabin soon discovered that a few personal items were missing from Stephanie's quarters. Notably, her bedding, 2 pillows with blue pillowcases, a burgundy bedsheet, and a Navajo pattern duvet were gone, as was Stephanie's gold wristwatch. These items were absent despite no sign of a struggle inside. Outside the cabin, however, a troubling clue turned up. There were traces of blood on the steps of the cabin, and they appeared to be quite fresh. Authorities have never released full details about the blood evidence, but its presence strongly indicated that some violence had occurred at the site. All signs appeared to point to one overwhelming conclusion. Stephanie Stewart was abducted by an unknown person or persons that morning. News of Stephanie's disappearance spread fast, and an enormous search operation was launched in the rugged foothills around the Athabasca Lookout. Search and rescue teams and park rangers, alongside hundreds of volunteers, combed through dense forest, looking for any trace of the missing fire spotter. Helicopters buzzed overhead, and tracking dogs sniffed for clues on the ground. Searchers scoured a radius of several kilometers around the tower, but nothing definitive was found. It became one of the largest search efforts in Alberta's history, yet it turned up painfully little. Notably, investigators treated the site as a potential crime scene from the start, due to the suspicious circumstances surrounding Stephanie's disappearance. They noted the totality of evidence was inconsistent with any voluntary departure. The fact that Stephanie left behind her truck, her keys, and even her morning coffee heating on the stove suggested she had fully intended to remain there for her day's work. Further, the missing bedding suggested that it may have been used to move Stephanie out of the cabin. Unfortunately, despite thorough forensic work, no definitive DNA or fingerprints leading to a suspect were publicly reported. Authorities did state that evidence at the scene convinced them Stephanie had been the victim of a slaying, even though her body was not found. With the case unsolved, various theories have emerged over the years about what might have happened to Stephanie Stewart. Some are grounded in investigative leads, while others are the product of armchair detectives puzzling over the scant evidence. The most widely accepted theory is that an unknown person approached Stephanie's cabin, likely in the early morning, and harmed her in the course of a robbery or assault. Perhaps someone driving along the highway took a detour up to the lookout, either hoping to find valuables or seeking shelter, and encountered Stephanie. The boiling water on the stove hints that she might have invited a visitor inside for tea or coffee, as she often did with guests, not realizing the danger. In this scenario, something turned violent, and the perpetrator hurriedly removed Stephanie before fleeing. The fact that the phone line was abruptly disconnected during the supervisor's calls suggests the intruder was present at 8:30 that morning and panicked when the phone rang. Another variant of this theory suggests that Stephanie actually fell victim to someone she knew. This theory explains why she would have opened her door for this unknown individual. For instance, If a park ranger had knocked on her door, she likely would have had no reason whatsoever not to welcome him in, not knowing what his intent was. That said, this avenue has been pursued, and as far as we are aware, based on information made public, no one in the Park Service is a suspect. Over time, speculation has focused on a few possible suspects, including one particularly notorious name, Travis Vader. Vader is a central figure in a high-profile Alberta criminal case. In 2010, he slew an elderly couple during a robbery, then burned their RV and hid their bodies in the wilderness. Given that Vader targeted senior citizens and was known to be involved in theft and violence, some have wondered if he could have crossed paths with Stephanie in 2006. Investigators noted that Vader was apparently in the vicinity of Hinton around the time Stephanie disappeared, fueling theories of his involvement. However, it's crucial to stress that Vader has never been charged or officially linked to the Stewart case. The Vader theory remains speculative, possibly a case of criminal coincidence, but it highlights the kind of human predator who could have been responsible. Notably, because Stephanie was in the wilderness, some initially wondered if a bear or other large animal could have attacked and dragged her away. This idea was thoroughly investigated and dismissed as the authorities found zero signs of an animal encounter. Further, a bear, for instance, wouldn't carefully unplug a phone or remove bedding to cover its tracks. That's just not what bears do, since they aren't worried about covering up their transgressions or whether a jury will convict them for a crime. In the months and years following 2006, as the case remained unsolved, Alberta's Forestry Department took concrete steps to improve safety and security at all fire lookout towers. Where once lookout sites were relatively open, they're now secured with locked gates and perimeter fences to keep intruders out. Notably, the signs directing tourists to these lookouts were removed, making them harder to find. The occupants of these fire lookouts have also been advised not to let in any guests, and to essentially treat any visitor as potentially hostile. To this end, the cabins themselves were retrofitted with stronger steel doors, shatterproof glass windows, and improved locks. Notably, brush and trees around each site were cleared to eliminate hiding spots and give workers a clear line of sight when someone approaches. At present, no trace of Stephanie Stewart has ever turned up, and her case remains a chilling national park mystery.